So welcome. If you're in the States, good morning. And if you're in the UK, good afternoon. Let's start by having a look at what hands up. That's those of us who are putting this together, what sort of organization we are and why we're doing this. So I think probably the first thing to point out is that all of this is non-profit. So when we sell the books and sell the software, around about, because we write it and Hannah does all the fantastic artwork and we publish it ourselves, means that around about 75 sale price actually can go straight back into supporting all of you using the course and other things, you know, in the Latin in schools world. So non-profit, I think, is a big part of what we're about. You'll see later on that as well as the physical books, there's a website which has got the materials on as well, a fair bit of teacher support. If you're in the UK, this covers there's two books that cover the language material for GCSE. And if you're in the US, then book one covers Latin 1, NLE Latin 1, and book two covers NLE Latin 2, plus a bit more. And we'll have a little look at that later on. The course on the whole is a reading course, but we're quite keen to create resources that will allow anybody teaching almost whatever method you like, and most of us do a bit of something and a bit of something else, don't we, and a bit of something else. So we'll put online materials if you want to do English into Latin, and if you want to create those materials and share them with others, that's great. And if you're taking more of an oral approach, we're really happy to work with anybody who wants to create any sorts of resources really around the course. When we started back in 2017, I think the two elements that were particularly important to us were increasing the representation of women and girls in Latin courses. So we've tried to go pretty much 50-50 in terms of gender. And in terms of diversity, we were really keen to try to reflect accurately who the people of the Roman Empire were from all over that empire. Down here, looking at the common people, I think, again, it has been the case, hasn't it, that a lot of our courses have reflected the wealthier members of society, even when they've tried to look at ordinary people. The ordinary people have actually been ordinary, wealthy people. So we're trying to move away from that. And finally, you know, I've heard for years, really, people say, well, can we have some history in our Latin course? Can we have some mythology in it? Can we try and link it to literature? So hopefully you'll see that we've had a go at doing that. Okay, so in very practical terms, it is currently 2 books, and I can show you, you know, there's the first book. And if you are a teacher and you want a sample copy, or your school wants a sample copy, we can send a free sample copy to every school, 1 per school. So if you haven't had one of those and you want one, just let us know. There's a form on our website, but if you find that difficult to, you know, to locate, just drop us a line. So there will be 2 physical textbooks. There will possibly be a third. Our plan is to make these 2. So the first one has just come out this summer. We're writing the second one now. That's going to be trialed in around about 40 schools, 20 UK, 20 US this coming year. And then that second book will be available this time next summer. And then if people like these books, we'll make a third. But if people tell us, well, look, that was interesting, but frankly, it's no good, then, you know, we're not going to carry on. But so far, things seem to be going quite nicely. Each of these first 2 books is 16 chapters. So chapters 1 to 16 in book 1 and 16 to 32 in book 2. Each chapter has got 16 pages. And just to show you the sort of the rough breakdown there, 10 pages language, roughly 5 of civ, and then we alternate between the chapters for a page on mythology and a page on history. So there's in those 16 chapters of book 1, 8 myth sections and 8 history sections. Let's take a look at the characters. There's a lot of characters in the course because it's a character-based course, and we start in Rome. So the first step really in our research was to look at Rome, and you can see there we're looking at Rome in 64 AD, and you might be thinking, well, that's the year of the Great Fire of Rome. Of course, that's why we chose 64 AD, and it also gives us Nero, who's quite an interesting character to play against, to suggest a population of around about a million people living in Rome at that date. If we look back at the original sources, I'll just let you read what some of the Romans were saying about Rome. So quite a melting pot. And looking at some of the research here on migration into Rome, so not just the people who are born and brought up in Rome, but various people who are coming into it. Well, who are they? Tacoma grouped them into these 10 categories. And if we then look at the numbers for those categories, you can see that in terms of migration into Rome, got elite, administrators, students, fairly relatively low numbers, but when you get down there to 9 enslaved people, former slaves, very high numbers, but also interestingly quite a divergence between the minimum and the maximum possible. Also, we're looking, if you look at there at number 6, quite possibly quite high numbers of temporary seasonal laborers. So that gives us a group of people to think about in terms of those moving into Rome from outside and where they may have come from. And of course, enslaved people coming from quite a wide range of parts of the empire. And we thought that we would start in the Suburra because we really wanted to focus on the normal, ordinary working poor of Rome. So there's our Suburra with a bar and a couple of hens. And then with that research, we can start to populate it with some of our characters. So this is one of the images it's in the book, and Hannah's done all the illustrations. And one of the great things about that, it allows us to be pretty precise and pretty flexible as well. So if we feel that we need to change something, it's actually very quick to make that change. I want to focus on, well, I'll give you maybe a minute. Imagine you were using this image in the classroom, the various things that you could pull out from that image. There's a great deal going on there, but what are the sort of activities that are taking place? And this is set at the first hour in the Suburra, so not long after dawn. A range of things you can see happening there. Some sort of slightly funny, gratuitous scenes, perhaps, but I want you to focus in on this lady here, Rufina. She's one of our core characters, the start of the course, and also take a look at this young man here, Carax. He's an enslaved boy. Okay, let's carry on. So quite a few characters in the course. These guys represent people from across the empire, and it is a lot. I must say, moving to a new course, I think one of the steps that we'll have to make for those of us moving to teaching this course is getting used to a lot of new characters. That said, actually, when you sort of count up the number of characters per chapter, actually aren't as many characters as in some other courses. And once you get used to these characters, actually, they don't seem as numerous as they might do to start with. Let's focus on here Sabina. If there is one core character, and I'm not certain that there is, but if there is one core character, then that person is Sabina. We will also see later on these guys here, Gisco, Numidian North African cavalry officer, his wife here, Katya, from Britain, and their son. But let's move on a little bit. So here is Sabina. And over here, Rufina, the lady that we saw running the bar, is Sabina's aunt. Dad. Now, one of the first things to notice here is that there is no mother in this setup. So what we don't have is a mum and a dad, 2 children, and a cat and a dog. This is not a sort of, a Roman representation of a modern nuclear family. What we were trying to get at here is maybe quite a difficult situation for Sabina, but one that was faced by a lot of Romans, in the fact that very often the mother would be perhaps have died in childbirth, would be absent for some other reason. We never explain that, actually. There isn't an answer to where is Sabina's mother, because we thought actually it's more interesting in the classroom for students and teachers to discuss what might have happened to Sabina's mum. Could she have been sold into debt bondage? Could she have died in childbirth? Maybe she's just away somewhere working or helping in another part of the city, or perhaps in a province. So that's an area for classes and students to discuss and think about, and rather than trying to sort of give an answer, actually we thought it'd be more interesting to let people come up with their own ideas. And on that front, if you use the course and you want to create more stories to go along with it, picking up on some of the characters who aren't here, then please feel free to do so and to share them with everybody else. Carax, as mentioned earlier, an enslaved boy owned by Faustus. Cortilla is an enslaved lady owned by Rufina. Now, we don't say this explicitly in the stories, but there is a very subtle sort of passage at one point where it would be possible to pick up on the idea that Faustus might be Carax's father. Some schools will want to go there with the treatment of slaves, enslaved women. Others absolutely won't want to go there, and I think we all understand that. We all teach in different situations. When we were preparing and researching this course, teachers said to us, look, we need to be honest with the students. We want this to be quite gritty, quite real, because we need to have those real and honest conversations with the students about what life was actually like in the Roman world. Well, okay, point taken, but not everybody teaches in an environment where you can have that conversation with all the students. So it's there for those of us who are in a position and who do want to discuss that, but it's not forced on anybody. And we've tried to take that approach on a number of occasions. Finally, we've got, not finally, actually, we've got one coming after as well, haven't we? But we'll look here at Alexander. There is a bit of love interest in the course, so it's not all sort of, bad news and difficult conversations. Alexander and Sabina meet each other when they are both together on a boat leaving Rome and heading to Arles in southern Gaul, south of France. Now, Sabina's got to leave because her dad, Faustus, who manages a sort of block of flats, an insula, not everybody will get access to this, but here in the UK, we have a sort of comedy program about the Romans called Plebs, and we've modeled Faustus a little bit on the landlord in plebs. He's not necessarily particularly good with money, our Faustus, and so he's lost a lot of money. And sadly for Sabina, that means that she's at risk of being sold into debt bondage. So they have to get her out of Rome. So she's escaping. And on this boat to Arles, she meets Alexander. And they find themselves in Arles, and they stay with a couple of older people, Letta and Populus. We said earlier on, didn't we, that we wanted to look at diversity in the empire. And diversity comes not only through skin tone and where the people come from, but also diversity in age. What was it like to be an old person living in the Roman Empire? So that's one of the reasons we bring in these two characters when we get to Arles. And then they head off from family, living in Canimbriga, and Canimbriga is in Portugal, Lusitania. So one of the things we're trying to do is go to different places in the empire, places that perhaps courses haven't been in the past. And for those of us who like to take school trips, and I know obviously if you're coming from the States, it's a long way to fly over, and absolutely now is obviously not the time when any of that's going to happen. But the Roman sites of southern France are really well worth a visit. Glarnham, loads of great sites in southern France, and then it's not a terribly long coach drive, about sort of 36 hours over to Italy and Rome. So worth thinking about. Okay. There, when they get to Canimbriga in Portugal, we meet Milo, a brickmaker, Alexander's father, and Hetia, his mum. And that is at the end of book 1, where those two, Sabina and Alexander, get married. So we did think we would end book 1 with the fire of Rome and great destruction, and for all sorts of reasons that actually didn't work out in the actual detail of the story writing. So we've ended up with a nice, happy, positive ending for book 1. Right, let's finally now look at Gisco and Katya. Really interesting couple of individuals. As I said earlier on, Gisco, North African cavalry officer, posted to Britannia, where he meets Katya, who is a local Briton. Now, you know, as often happened when military officers were posted abroad, a relationship develops. This is a really interesting relationship because this is happening. We see a little flashback to Britain in the time of the Boudiccan rebellion. So this relationship starts in the early 60s. And Katya's family find themselves working in and around Londinium when it is attacked by Boudicca's troops from the Iceni and the Trinovantes. Now, one of the things we're trying to do there is show the students that the Roman world and the provinces were actually quite complex places. It wasn't as though there was a country, Britain, that already existed. On that landmass that we call Britannia, we have different tribes of people different groups of people who sometimes got along and worked together and who sometimes fought each other. And on occasion, the Romans were in the middle of that mix. So Katya of Britain finds herself being defended by a Roman against other Britons. And what we want the students and teachers to think about is, what do we mean when we talk about a Roman or a Briton or a Romano-Briton? Where does, from an individual's point of view, what was your identity? You know, did Katya think of herself as a Briton, or when they reach Rome, does she think of herself as a Roman or a Romano-Briton? And what about Gisco with North African heritage? He'd never been to Rome, finds himself posted in Britain as well. So all sorts of ideas there to unpack. As these two find their way into Rome, they come across this archway with the statue of Claudius on top. And Claudius, the emperor, who gave the go-ahead for the invasion of Britain. So how is Katya going to react to that? And of course, we were writing this, well, probably about 2018. To statues and people becoming much more conscious about how we think about statues and how different people might interpret them and react to them in different ways. But as it happens, quite a topical and important issue for the students to be able to look at and discuss through the lens of of a Britain coming into Rome and that distance of 2,000 years. Okay, so there's a few of the characters. Let's look at the language and how the language develops. This is book one, and if, like me, you've got a sort of a set of pictures of us down the right hand side, you might want to sort of push them off to one side for this. There's 16 chapters in book one, and each chapter has 1 or 2, sometimes 3 language points. The material there that's in green, that shows you language points that relate to verbs, and the material in blue is nouns, and orange are other sort of little bits and pieces, little bits of syntax. What you can see there, that if you look across those 16 chapters, by the end of those 16 chapters, by the end of book one, we've met the nominative and accusative, ablative, dative, genitive cases. So we've met, and the vocative there in 12, we've met all the cases by the end of the first book. And in terms of persons of the verb, we see first, second, third person singular in chapter 1, first and second plural in 4, and the third person plural gets picked up there in chapter 3 with nominative plurals. So by the end of the first 4 chapters, we've met all the persons. Then we do the present infinitive in chapter 5. Then we go into the we were going to come here in 14, we were going to put the pluperfect there, but when we talked to teachers and to examiners, they said, actually, please go with the future first. The pluperfect is a little less useful. So we do the future tense of just the first and second conjugations there in 14. The reason we do first and second conjugations is that they're so much easier to spot for students than the future of the third and fourth, pretty near the start of book 2. So if we take that as if you like, the first 6 chapters, the first 6 chapters give us all the persons of the verb plus the present infinitive, and those 6 chapters are set in Rome. Then in 7 to 10, we have a flashback to Britannia. The characters in a bar in the Suburra, and they ask, well, what was life like in Britannia? And so we have a little section, 7 to 10, with that flashback, mainly focusing on Boudicca's rebellion, but a little bit of look at Londinium, and moving on to Aquae Bath afterwards. When we were writing this, teachers said, could we do a chapter on the imperfect and then a separate chapter on the perfect afterwards? Well, we try to do that, and I would say if you can write 4 stories all in the imperfect tense without needing the perfect at all, then you are better story writers than we are, because we gave it a very good shot, but it really was not possible for us to write, you know, a number of stories only using in the imperfect tense. So what we have there are 2 stories in the imperfect, and then we look at the imperfect head on, and then the second half of chapter 7 we move into the perfect tense, just using V forms again because they're so much easier to identify, and then we pick up the other forms in chapter 8. Okay, something that you might find a bit surprising is that we've put indirect statement in chapter 15, so fairly early on. If you look at that closely, you'll see it's just using the present infinitive, because that's the only infinitive the students have met at this point. So they're actually fairly straightforward, and particularly if you're teaching a reading approach, it really is just a question to a more natural one. We wanted to get that in there fairly early on, so that students would get quite a lot of experience with that construction before they meet more complex versions of indirect statement later in book 2. And that seems to be working out fairly well so far as we can see. Okay, so that's book 1, and we can come back to this if you've got lots of questions. Here is the plan that we are currently working through for book 2, and I know it's all sort of lots of different colors and probably looks a bit confusing, so I'll explain a little bit about it in a minute. Just to say that we are writing chapters 19 into 20 at the moment, so things may change, but on the whole we expect the language map to look fairly similar to this for book 2. So let me explain a little bit what's going on. Well, first of all, are the main language points in the chapter. So chapter 17 to 19 wrap up the indicative active. So you can see we've got the pluperfect, then the rest of the future, and then present participles. 20 to 22 deal with the passive, and the deponent there comes towards the end of that. Then 23 through to 27 starts looking at the subjunctive and the uses of the subjunctive. And then when we get to the back end of book 2, we're getting into more complex things here in 29, ablative absolute, 32, gerundive, and so on. So slightly more complicated things. It looks like there's a lot happening, but if you look at these things that don't have a sort of a yellowish background, actually a lot of them are fairly light touch topics. Well, uses of present participle, that's not going to be much more than the present participle in particular situations. None of it is likely to be particularly complicated. Here looking at eo and their pharaoh. Again, the students will have seen quite a lot of these forms actually already, so it's just a chance to have half a page to look at that and say, okay, well, if you've been wondering about this verb, here's a little bit more about it. When we're down here, fourth and fifth declensions, at the minute they're separated out into 2 different notes. In reality, depending on how the page structures go, that they may combine into one. Again, it's not going to be a vast topic. Okay, so that's the overall sort of feel of book 2. In that, you might see there's a right-hand column here headed additional language online. That is really for those schools or those individuals who really want to look at particular aspects in quite a bit more detail. So you may not be able to see because it might be behind the pictures of us. But here in 22, we've got Marlowe, for example. Well, a lot of us might not touch that, but some of us might want to look at it with 1 or 2 students or with all of the students. So we thought, now that we're building this course in an age where on the internet we can put so much extension material, then that could be a good thing to do for those who want to go into a bit more depth, and it doesn't to everybody. Okay, I know this will be far too small to see, but I just wanted to say a little bit about how we approach vocabulary in the course. And we're conscious that we're writing this course to be used in the UK and in the US. And, really, I know we all think, well, things are very different here and things are very different there. Actually, my experience of going into a lot of schools in the UK and to quite a lot of schools in the US is that, students are pretty similar wherever you go. The vocabulary that's important for the UK is the GCSE core vocabulary. The vocabulary that's important for the US tends to be high frequency vocabulary for literature, the Dickinson 1000. So what we've done is come up with a categorization system that allows us to track. We for the US, we see is it in the top 500 most frequent words or the second 500, or is it not in the top 1,000? And for the UK, we track, is it in both exam board lists, OCR and Educas? Is it in one but not the other? And is it in neither of them? And that creates, it's sort of slightly boring technical word, creates 9 categories of words, and it allows us to say, well, this word is in category 1, what we would call B1. It's in the top 500 most frequent words in literature. And of course, that's good for the UK as well, right? Because a lot of us take our students on to read lit. So it's in the top 500 words, and it's in both UK exam board lists. So that means that word is a word we really want to use as often as we can. And at the other end of the spectrum, we get words that aren't in either exam board lists in the UK and aren't in the top 1,000 most frequent words. So we call that an N3 word, and we want to stay away from that word as far as we can. So that tells you a little bit about how we go about doing things. Also for the UK, we track if the exam board has given particular definitions for that word, more than one definition, we track whether we are using one or 2 or more of those definitions at a particular point. The vocabulary learning lists for each chapter, because I hear it a lot. Well, a lot of us say, well, I don't tell my students to learn the vocab at all. And great if that's your thing and that works. I know plenty of schools where that works really well. They don't set vocab learning, and plenty of others that do. So we've selected 20 words from each chapter to go into the vocabulary learning list for that chapter. For UK schools, for book 1, all the words in the first book in those vocab lists are on the DVL, the defined vocab list for OCR and for Educas. So you shouldn't be looking at anything there that isn't on that vocab list. And for US teachers, all those, I think 85% of those words are in the top 1,000 of Dickinson frequency, and I think 65% of them are in the top 500. So they're pretty, most of those words are pretty high value words. Words that aren't in the top 1,000 are words, in fact, interestingly, like ankilla. Well, we couldn't write a course without using the word ankilla quite a lot, so that's in there. And you might in passing notice how we're glossing these words. So word like ankilla, slave, comma, enslaved person. So gone are the days where we talk about a maid or a slave girl. We thought at the outset, why do we say slave girl but we don't say slave boy? So we just thought we'll put slave brackets female or male, and also enslaved person, because quite a number of us are moving away from being comfortable using the term slave, at least using it exclusively. So okay, let's have a little look at the language in action, and this is the very start of chapter 1. What we wanted to do here, because we're doing first, second, and third person singular, we wanted to get the characters talking directly to the student. There's a good argument for saying, well, this is this person, that is that person, and that is this other person. But the sort of the downside of that is that then you are outside looking in. And what we wanted to do was have Sabina say, look, this is who I am. This is where I live. And you might be able to see, she says here, ego sum and insulin. If you look up there, you can see her looking out of her window. There are all sorts of other things going on in this image that we'll have a quick look at. So a few details here. Well, you might question some of these things. So for example, this person emptying out their, let's just say emptying out their pot at this point. Is someone actually going to empty out a pot with quite a lot of people underneath? Probably not. But, it's in there. We can have a bit of fun with that in the classroom. We can discuss whether that would or wouldn't have happened in those situations. We've got somebody here on their balcony with their washing. There's all sorts of things going on down here. Some of you might object and say, well, if this is meant to be the Suburra in Rome in the, at the sort of dawn, then well, there shouldn't be a cart going through. Well, you're right, except for the fact that carts taking building materials are allowed. So, and if you're looking at this and thinking, well, I don't know anything about this stuff, the teacher's notes, that the teacher's notes, as most commentaries about most things, are much more extensive than actually the chapter of the book itself. So we tend to have teacher's notes for each chapter running to about 20 pages. There's a lot of detail in there. So we've got the cart, we've got people arguing. What might they be arguing about? Look at the different types of food, look at the animals, look at the skin tones of the people there. Some people have got their heads covered. What's going on here? Well, here, this is Faustus. Now, this is page 1, maybe page 2. Faustus is whitewashing out something that says, we might recognize it as Faustus est fur. Faustus is a thief. Well, the students don't know what fur means at this point, but they do meet it. They do meet that word in the 3rd story in the chapter, and then you can come back and say, well, let's look at this image again. What had somebody said about Faustus? So there's quite a lot of depth to these images, and it's not that we just use them, there and then in our teaching of that story just at the start. We can often come back to them later on. Here is a little scene, which is one of those scenes and things in the course that you may or may not want to do with look at with. Here is getting quite a telling off from this lady, and when we have another lady standing just next to him. So there's a scene there of prostitution. Well, that doesn't need to be said to the students. You don't have to point that out, and they probably wouldn't draw that conclusion. But for the older students, it is something that when you're ready, you can have a look at and discuss with them about Roman attitudes to sex and sexuality. You might not at all be comfortable doing that with some of your students, and some of us teaching older students might feel that it's actually something that needs to be discussed. This is an image that we saw earlier on, so I won't dwell on that one. The language, obviously, it's really impossible, I would argue, to separate language from culture. But so the language feeds directly into the culture. But I also want to show you this here, this little first story was covering first, second, and third persons of the verb, and the students would have met two. They've seen that a number of times there. They've also met clamosa and in and subura. So all of that actually is fairly familiar to them. They're comfortable by this point with the S ending of a verb. So the only thing that is new to them is ero, meaning to wander. Well, that's not a huge step to take. So after the very first story, the students can have a little look at a bit of original, I know some people complain about the term original, but let's say a bit of Roman Latin, and have a fair shot at understanding what's going on. The other thing that we've done in the Civ is use quite a lot of primary source material in translations to show the students how it is we think we know what we think we know. I mentioned earlier on the teacher's notes. This isn't really the time to look at them in detail, but I just want to show you the amount of material that is there. So for all of those images in that first part of the first story, there are a lot of detailed ideas about what you could do with that image. I would say it doesn't continue in that depth, with questions on every image all the way through the course. But for those of us not used to reading courses, then I think the sort of the first couple of chapters of teacher's notes would give a pretty good idea of how to go about doing things. And the other thing I would say about this is that, we're non-profit, we are here the entire time. If you're using this course and you are stuck, then feel free to say, Will, Hannah, can I do a quick Zoom? If it's 5 minutes, how does this work? What's that for? Why is this like this? What we want is for you to have all the support you need to make the lessons work well. So the other thing I think we would say is that if The teacher's guides are free on the website, and you have to pay a little bit to access the website. And if you can't afford that, or you don't want to pay, we want you to have these teacher's guides. So if you are using the course and don't get on the web, feel free to say, can I have the teacher's guides anyway? Because I think we'd like you to have them. Not all the stories in the course are a graphic novel approach. Of course, we need to prepare the students to read larger chunks of text. So some of them, and quite a number of them, are presented in this sort of more traditional way. Very quickly, let's have a look at the first language note. There in the textbook, it's really just saying, it's very light touch, isn't it? It's saying OST, IU, he's your it. And a little bit on some, and then a little language practice underneath, which is just a tiny bit of translation practice. So that's what's in the textbook, very light touch. But online, and these aren't all there yet, but we're putting them in place. Online, what we're doing is saying, okay, well, quite a number of us might want to teach more detail than that. So if you do want to talk about 4 different conjugations and their different forms, then there's further material for that online. And also there an activity where the students are pushed harder. They have to supply the right form of the verb themselves. And really that's, you know, that we can just carry on doing more and more and more of that sort of thing. There's no end, I think, to the amount of differentiated material that we can put online. What we'd really like is for those of us using the course, all of us to sort of chip in, do a little bit and say, okay, well, I can do this other thing. Here's some resources that I've created that I can share. And it just makes everybody's life easier, doesn't it? There's a little bit of English to Latin as well for those of us who are teaching E2L. And again, that's a small amount there in the book. I think we can do much more online again and have a pretty comprehensive bit of support there for E2L. Very quickly, I just want to show you how we introduce the imperfect. So this is the start of chapter 7, where a couple of our characters bump into each other in the form. They haven't seen each other for a long time, and they used to be soldiers together in Britain. So you can see in image 5, if you look, you might look sort of closely at the screen, but Faustus starts asking, well, what were you doing in Britain? Were you often fighting? No, I wasn't often fighting. I was often helping, and we were doing these things and these other things, So that's one of the ways in which we were able to get quite a lot of imperfects in there, at the same time as trying to show the students that if you're in the Roman army, it didn't mean to say that you were out fighting every day. Often you were doing quite a lot of construction work. Okay, then if you look at De Britannia on the right hand side there, you can see Katya starting to talk about her parents. Well, I used to live near London with my parents. My father was a blacksmith. My mother was a fantastic artist. They were making these swords, and then it's a little bit like a scene out of Casablanca, well, I remember you were wearing this, no, I was wearing that. Well, you were doing this thing, no, I was doing that thing. You were walking with this person, no, I was walking with that person. So that's how we sort of get those imperfects in there. Let's talk now, let's move on from language. I know we don't have a vast amount of time left, so let's have a little look at where the course goes. Book 1, the first 6 chapters, Rome. The next 4 chapters, 7 to 10 with the little green bars, are in Britannia. And then 11 to 16 are set in southern Gaul and Lusitania, with a flashback to the Fire of Rome in 12. And then looking ahead for book 2, so the top row there is book 1. Book 2, we start in Pompeii, a few chapters in Pompeii. Then we head over to North Africa. Then we go to Greece in the east, and then we come back to Rome, and we're going to finish in Rome in AD 68 with the death of Nero. And one way or another, we're going to work it so that our characters are somehow involved in Nero's death. Okay, I'll move on quickly from that. A little bit of mythology then. What we don't try and do in the book is tell the myth, because we thought there's all sorts of places we can go to find the myth. And normally on our website, we'll have, links to here 3 or 4 different places where you can find different versions of this myth. Well, one of the reasons for that is that, if you take a myth like Theseus and the Minotaur, if you're teaching very young children, you may not want to go into all the details about how the Minotaur came into existence. If you're dealing with older children, you can teach it in a different way. So we thought, let's not just reinvent the wheel and have the myth on the page. We'll use that page instead for ideas of how to think about that myth. What could you do with that myth in the classroom? So, for example, Theseus and the Minotaur. We've got there an image of bull leaping from Knossos. Well, how might that relate to the myth? What about the floor plan of Knossos? How might that floor plan relate to the idea of a labyrinth? Now, obviously in the book, sometimes these images are fairly small. So on the website, you can get them full screen. And if you're projecting them, then, they are as big as you need them to be. But all the way through with the myths, the idea is to think, what does that, what were the Greeks or the Romans doing with that myth? How can we look at it? How can we think about it? If we go back to Romulus and Remus, well, what were the Romans doing with the creation story where your hero kills his own brother? How could that fit into the history of Rome? And then we link that to civil war and so on. So lots you can to do with that, but every other chapter just has one page on myth, so not a vast amount overall. We've tried to relate them to the theme of the particular chapter. So, for example, Prometheus goes in there with fire in chapter 12. Let's have a quick look at history. Start off by just putting some context there, where we are in Rome, AD 64, and even trying to explain to the students, what do we mean by AD? Looking then at the different phases of government. Where we put resistance in there in chapter 9 with Boudicca's rebellion, and what we wondered at some point about saying, well, should we have, the history of the Boudiccan rebellion? But we thought actually it's not very useful, because we don't want the students to think it was just these, the Britons, how fantastically different they were, and aren't we always sort of fighting against, external oppressors on our own? We thought this is not the right message that we want to send out to the students. So let's show them other parts of the empire where people were rebelling and fighting back. So we've looked there at Vercingetorix. And in fact, one of the things we want to do with the course is show students how, the Romans weren't just in Britain and Italy, or France and Italy. The Romans aren't sort of necessarily a particular sort of thing just for our own culture, but how they spread across all sorts of different lands, to help actually for the students to see that how much in common there was. Piracy, there a little look at how women are presented in Roman history through the lives of Lucretia, Sempronia, and Agrippina, or I should say the representation of their lives. And also then a topic on civil war, partly preparing the students for the idea that Otho is going to be preparing to see what he can do to replace Nero. Okay, very quickly, because we are pretty much out of time. All the images in the book are there as well. There are loads of additional materials that you can download from the website, and as we said earlier on, the teacher's guide is there. But we also have additional evidence for the cultural materials, so things that we couldn't fit into the book, we've put online. You guys may well know that we made all the tech for so if you use the CLC, you'll find this fairly familiar, but now we're taking a lot of our tech that we used there and taking it forward. So this is a version of the stories where you can click on sort of dotted underlined words, and it will give you derivations and, if you like, loan words, but mainly derivations in other languages. And again, if this is your thing and you want to help out, then, we're more than happy to put other languages in there. I would say if you're using this in the classroom, do this after reading the story, because it's super easy to get sidetracked when you're looking at those things. The vocab trainer, we're calling it trainer rather than a tester. This now tracks how the students are getting on, and it also predicts what they're trying to type. So what we're trying to do here is reduce the number of instances where the students get marked wrong because they didn't know how to spell the English word. So as they start typing, it gives them a couple of options there, and they can they can just carry on typing, or they can click the right one, or they can hit 1 or 2 on their keyboard. There's also multi-choice. Then this is it showing how they're getting on with each individual word. So you can see there, DAs, okay, 9 successful attempts with that one. RAB, we're just getting started. So it will show the student very granular information, but it will also pass that back to you as a teacher. And then you can see, overall, how are my students doing, and which ones have, are really hitting the high numbers. I think we need to improve this a little bit because, as 1 or 2 people have pointed out, at the minute it's not super clear which chapters that refers to. But overall, I think that our ability to feed back really precise, useful information to teachers, I think is going to be extremely useful. I hope so, anyway. And do tell us what you'd like to see it do that doesn't. Working right now on chapter 11. You can see actually there they've had a go at all 16 chapters, but right now working on 11. Up to 11, they've got 55%. That's the number of times they've logged in, and that's the last time they logged in. So all that data, when the students have said to you, "Oh, I spent ages practicing my vocab," you'll be able to go on and say, "Well, actually, Fred, it looks like you haven't been on that vocab tester for 2 months." So could be useful, but also hopefully useful to the student as well to see what their strengths and interests are. Okay, a little sorting activity. I'm quite interested in seeing whether we can link these through to can-do statements. So if the student here can disambiguate between a verb that means I, you, he, she, it, we can feed that into a can-do statement. And this is then the final report on that. That first one, sum there, a tick after 3 goes. So that helps us to see, actually, not very confident with that one. Something to look at again. Again, you might have seen us develop this software in the past. It's automatic marking of translation. So the student gets a sentence on the screen, types in an answer, and the software automatically marks it. But now we've set it up so that if the student clicks on sedet, it will show them is sitting, and vice versa. And this would work for everything. So if I clicked on any of the older man, it would highlight senex. The point there is to help the students, if they're struggling, to see which bit of the Latin links to which bit of the English, or vice versa. We're working on putting audio in place for all the stories online. I don't think we'll go to research now, but there's an awful lot of that was just showing that in order to use the word "navigo" in a particular story, we go as far as checking out that it is possible at that particular time of year to sail from wherever they were starting to wherever they were ending. But I think probably time is up for us doing that sort of thing. So that was a pretty quick sort of zoom in sort of both ways. There may well be, you might just want to say, nobody ask a question, please, let's all go. But if you've got questions, now is the time, and feel free just to turn your microphone on. Or Hannah, have there things come in that you want to flag?
Yeah. There was one question that came in that I said we'd come back to, which was just how long do you expect it to take to teach one chapter?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So how long does it take to cover the course? As I said earlier on, we trialed it in about 40 schools last year. What I would say is it depends entirely on the school. So Sarah, for example, you tried it in your school. You start when the students are sort of 13, 14. You had to get the students to a particular point at the end because there's an exam coming up, and you roughly did 1 chapter every sort of 2-3 weeks, I
Yeah,
would guess.
yeah.
But can I
Yeah,
just say, and I'm going to ask you to say a bit more about that, Sarah, but just for colleagues teaching in the US, Sarah, I should point out, you probably only see your children twice a week.
yeah, 2 hours a week.
Do you want to say a little bit more about the pacing? I know it kind of all went a bit weird at the end, didn't it, with Corona, but...
Yeah, so originally my plan had been to see whether I could do the whole of book one. I think probably that would have been a little bit of a stretch, but not that much. But basically, I have finished in, I think it's chapter 14, isn't it? When she's deciding whether to go with him or not. So I'm halfway through chapter 14, and the kids had followed the pace quite nicely. I have had to be a bit choosy about how many elements I do because there's so much thing in the book. But basically, a week and one homework, I have managed to cover pretty much almost the whole of book one in 1 year. So I can do book two in year 10.
I want to say there, because Donna, you always tell me, well, British children, they're different and they know. Sarah, tell me about your students.
Okay, my students are kind of selected. I'm teaching a comprehensive school, but I only teach the top set. But, you know, they range pretty much from people who are extremely good linguists to people who struggle a bit with language. So it's quite mixed. I mean, it's not extremely bottom heavy, but it's a mixed ability class.
So I would say, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, that your classes probably represent roughly the top 30-35% of the UK attainment range.
Yeah, with the odd character that is a bit below, but yeah, very much so.
So that's Sarah, you know, in your school there, Sarah, 2 hours a week with students who are sort of 13-ish, 13, 14,
yeah, 13,
starting.
14,
yeah. Now, other schools we've had where the students are younger, maybe 11, you know, starting 11, 12 years old, they did probably 8 chapters across the, so half the book across the year. And what they said is that we wanted to go faster, but there is so much material that we wanted to investigate. But normally, I think on the cultural side of things, and I think that's partly because it's new, you know, and when it's new, it's sort of exciting, and we're more interested in it as teachers. And I think that led quite a number of people to do quite a bit more with it. Then maybe next year they might say, actually, I'm not going to you know, to follow all those avenues, but it's up to every teacher. I would certainly say that book one is a year's worth of material for pretty much everybody, and for some people it will be 2 years of material, is my guess. Does that answer that question for everybody, or do some people want to go into more depth? Okay, any other questions, queries? Feel free to shout.
I just wanted to ask Will, classes, it's an independent school. From what you said, I'm reckoning on the first 2 years on book one, and then going up to GCSE on book two, supplemented with the literature test. Would that be a reasonable?
Which UK year group do you start in, Caroline?
We start in year 7, but I'm almost wondering whether to do a more general introduction because their whole linguistic knowledge is so weak, and then to use your book one to sort of recap and really set the pace going in year 8.
Yeah.
And so year 8 and 9 with book one, and then book 2, 10 and 11, and that should get them to...
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, for colleagues in the US, to go from the UK year group to the US grade, you take away 1, I think. So UK year 7 is US 6th grade. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Kind of, if there's no rush, don't rush. You know, what we've tried to do is really, from a UK school point of view, is we've cut out everything, all the language topics that aren't GCSE. So if you want to go back, we'll put the sort of the PowerPoint and the recording online. But if you look back at it, I think other than net and quet as sort of enclitics on the end, there isn't anything in the first book that isn't GCSE, and there's very little in the second book that isn't GCSE up to chapter 27. So I think, you know, if you're doing EDUCAS, 27 is your endpoint. If you're doing OCR in the UK, 32 is your endpoint. If you're in the US, I think, you know, have a look at that sort of correlation for book 2 between material in book 2. But I think, kind of going back to your sort of your pacing, that seems good to me. I mean, I think what I would do is have a look at the physical copy of the book, and, you know, think, actually, how long would I want to use to deliver one of these chapters? And all the chapters are pretty standard. I mean, chapter 1 may be a little shorter. I would be tempted, maybe, you know, choose chapter 4, chapter 6, look at that and think, if I was going to develop a, you know, schedule of work around this chapter, how would I want to organize it? How long would I want to give myself? And probably that would be pretty consistent across all of them.
The thing is, what we try and aim to do, because everybody does Latin to the end of year 9, so it's really all about encouraging their whole knowledge of grammar along with the ancient world. And so your course, I see, really comes in with the dictionary, the derivations, which is really, really good just for their linguistic ability. So then once they choose the subject in year 10, obviously the pace and the focus is slightly different. But from what I could see, your book 1 covers books 1, 2 and half of 3 of the CLC, which is about where we stop with year 9. Although we weren't able to cover all the linguistic and CLC, all the reading, because of
mapping sort of CLC to Suburani, I would put probably the book 1 of the of Suburani at the first 2 books of the CLC.
Yeah, because
I would say roughly.
Come in book 3, don't they? And that's
yeah.
That's what I had in mind. That's why I thought 7, 8, 9, then moving into. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does, because we also have lots of project work, and also, do you have the quantities in the text?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And on that front, for the audio recordings, you know, I always wondered when we were at Cambridge about, you know, what sort of voice to use for them. And this time here with Suburani, what we've done is, our solution to that was actually, and we had to do it during lockdown, was to work with 8 different readers, some from the US, some from the UK, some from Italy, some from Spain. So actually you'll find that the voices for the stories are actually quite different to one another, and different people take quite a different approach. And again, it's not that there's a right or wrong with that. What we want to do is allow the students, encourage the students to hear different ways of doing things. You know, we often say in the UK, well, the V for we are a soft V. Well, in Italy, no, you're going to hear a strong V. I think Hannah Zandra would do it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So quite, you know, it really is trying to sort of break down some of these things that we've sort of accepted for a while are the way to do things, and say, maybe. I mean, one of the interesting things on that is word order. I have spent 28 years teaching children that adjectives normally come after the noun, unless, you know, they're adjectives of quantity and size, so on. Well, actually, if you look at some research that isn't new, it goes back to 1918, there really is very little evidence to support that idea. So what we've tried to do, we have to sort of balance it a little bit, because of course the teachers in the UK are preparing for an assessment system where on the whole the adjectives will be after the noun, but we're all preparing the students ultimately to read literature where they are going to be where the Romans put them. So we've tried to mix things up a little bit there, and you know, again, try to just be a little bit more real. And I suppose that's what you can do when you're starting again, you know, from scratch. You can look at everything that's been learned over the last, well, not just 50 years, 100 years, and say, now we know what we know. And now we're building a course where in the world of the internet, we can start completely from scratch and we can correct a lot of things that actually aren't quite right. And hopefully that will mean that the students have a slightly smoother transition, for example, to literature.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Cool.
Karenza's just asked about assessments.
Yes, at the minute, Karenza, I would say there really aren't any, except for the fact that Bar has made for each chapter, other than chapter 1, she's written a comprehension on that's on the website that is in the style of an EduCass comprehension on a piece of text. So they're there for chapters 2 to 12. And we put all of those comprehensions online because we thought actually there's a lot of pressure on space in the book, and we thought what we can do is put that stuff online, and then it's like really boring, but you can print it out either with spaces for the kids to write on, or just as as small as possible to get it on as little photocopying as possible. The other thing we will move, and again we don't do this yet, but we will move to them being digital, so that if the students are at home, they can type their answers in, and our software will do the auto marking as far as it's able to auto mark, and then the stuff that it can't auto mark will come to the teacher to do the final sort of top and tailing with. But in terms of tough assessments as let's sort of mirror exactly what an OCR or an EduCass assessment might look like, no, I would say they don't exist. There's a mark scheme for those comprehensions that Bar's made that is again in the style of the exam board. So I'd say have a look at those, and for all of you, if you want access to the to the new teachers website that we launched this week, if you're fairly serious about thinking about using this, which you must be because you wouldn't have given up time to sit through all this day, then we can certainly give you access to all that stuff to have a look at what's there. One thing I am conscious of is that a number of people have said, look, have you got assessments at the end of each chapter? And at the minute we don't, but building them I think is sort of a middle level priority for us, because I think quite a few people would like to see those sorts of things. And I'm conscious then that takes us into a question for this US. Quite a lot of us in the US want to have multi-choice questions, and we want them on the language and the grammar and the culture and history and so on. And those of us in the UK want them formulated a slightly different way. I don't really see that as too much of a problem, but we can do both those things, and as far as possible allow people to sort of cut and paste and so on. If anybody wants to help develop that stuff, we don't have, there's not bucket loads of cash sat here, but we can pay people, a reasonable amount for their time to help develop some of those materials. If we would say, please have a go at one, we'll pay you to do one. Not every, some of us are great teachers in the classroom. It turns out when we come to creating resources, it's not our thing. Others are, great at resource creation. So we'll ask everybody to sort of have a go at one first. But if that works out, then yeah, fantastic. If you're up for developing lots of that stuff. Okay. Are there other questions, Hannah, or does somebody want to chip in with a question? Silence. Excellent. Okay. Well, look, that's a really quick initial look. What we're going to do in some of the other sessions is look in a bit more detail at how the language works, a bit more detail at how the culture works, but we're also running sessions next week and the week after, more general sessions regardless of which reading course you teach on, how to different approaches to stories, integrating culture and so on. So look, thanks very much everybody for giving up either your morning or your afternoon. We're here the whole time. So, genuinely, we spent a lot of time looking at I was writing some notes on brick making last night. So if anybody wants to get in touch with something which is a little bit different and it's an interesting question about it, you aren't going to be causing us any trouble. It'd be really nice to chat through whatever your questions are. Cool. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for coming along, and hopefully see you at one of the other events next week or the week after.
Cheers, everybody.